Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the third Occasional International Cinematography Summit Day at the Academy. I'm Andy Maltz, Managing Director of the Science and Technology Council, your hosts for today, and I'll also be your Master of Ceremonies for today. So I'm going to keep my comments to a minimum and let the real professionals speak in just a moment. I just wanted to point out how remarkable this is. Representatives from 39 different countries and territories all gathered here in Hollywood today. That's pretty amazing. Well done, ASC organizers. So we have a very full day for you today, so I am going to vacate the podium and get things going and hand off the microphone to John Bailey.
Good morning, everyone, my fellow cinematographers from here and around the world, and welcome to the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences Pickford Center. I greet you on behalf of my fellow Academy Cinematography branch members, our executive committee, and your host today, the Academy Sci-Tech Council. You're sitting in the Academy's Linwood Dunn Theater. Lynn was a dear friend of mine. He was not only a two-term past president of the ASC and an Academy governor in two separate branches, but he was a pioneer in motion picture visual effects technology. From King Kong in 1933 to The Devil's Reign in 1975. You most likely saw the Acme Dunn optical printer in the foyer before you entered. If you didn't, during the break on your way out, it's right at the top of the steps, and check it out, it's been recently restored. Lynn received the first of his 2 Oscar statuettes for creating this printer. He also, significant fact, but not too many people know this, I hope this is a surprise to you, he also photographed the iconic radio tower trademark at the head of every RKO Pictures movie. This very building, like the ASC Clubhouse, where you have been hosted this week, is steeped in Hollywood history. Along with Darren Okada and Mandy Walker, I'm an Academy governor in the cinematographers branch. But more relevant to our work here today, I'm serving my 3rd year on the Academy Science and Technology Council. I'm also the first cinematographer to be elected Academy president by the 54 filmmakers of the Board of Governors. I think it's fair to say that this unique bully pulpit has helped me better explain the art of cinematography to interested moviegoers worldwide, while also focusing attention on all the so-called motion picture crafts. And I'd just like to talk for a second about the crafts. It's a word that's been used in Hollywood for those of us that are referred to as below the line, below the main budget line, first page budget line. Above the line includes the actors, the producers, the writers, the rest of us. You know, we're part of the manufacturing process. We're called below the line, or crafts if they want to give us a little more respect. In the entire history of the Academy, 90 years, there has only been one other president that has come from below the line, and that was Gene Allen from 1983 to 85. So it's a significant kind of fact that I think now, in this age, a second president came up from the crafts. And I must say, the support I've received has been absolutely amazing. And I think it's kind of testimony to the significance that cinematographers are playing today, not just because of the digital revolution, but because there's a newfound appreciation, I think, because so many cinematographers today are coming not from just a narrow field of, you know, grown up with a Brownie camera or an 8mm or a Sony Handycam or something, but we approach our work and our whole concept, our aesthetics and our guiding principles, not just based on the narrow technology of equipment that we use, but because we can talk about, express our thoughts, and communicate to our fellow filmmakers on the set the whole entity of what a motion picture is. And this is why I was elected president, not because of my work as a cinematographer, but because I spent so much of my career, as my fellow ASC members know, talking about and writing about the history and the preservation of film. And it's given me a really unique perspective to sort of engage the so-called crafts, because the reality on the Board of Governors, the 17 branches that are represented by the board, most of us are so-called crafts. And so I've had an incredible year, I think it's almost a year now, 10th or 11th month, where I've been able to sort of reach out from my own pulpit as a cinematographer, but engage in a very broad-based way with all of my fellow governors and members of the Academy as filmmakers, not just cinematographers. And the only thing I'd like to say to you today is I know you're spending most of the week here immersed in new technology and some really cutting-edge sort of aesthetics and so forth, but just keep in mind, that as cinematographers today, not only do we have the opportunity, but I think there's an expectation that we will bring a whole sort of a global sense of what cinema is to our work. Especially, and let's be blunt, and you all know this, there are a lot of directors and young directors out there today that really have come right out of film school into the cauldron. And they look to us on the set more than anybody else to give us a sense of guidance and maturity and an understanding of what a movie really is about. Anyway, that's my digression. For those of you who may not already know, the Science and Technology Council is an Academy division under the aegis of the Academy Foundation, which also supervises the Herrick Library and the Academy Film Archive. Its mandate is to preserve the history of motion picture technology, to educate our full membership, industry professionals, and the general public about how science and technology serves motion pictures, leading our art form in new and creative initiatives and programs to make the movies a continuing vital experience for audiences. The Academy has always been at the forefront of setting industry standards, from its introduction of the Academy Leader on November 1st, 1930, to its recent creation of ACES, the Academy Color Encoding System, about which you'll hear more this morning. Council members, volunteer project leaders, and the SciTech Council staff will share with you some of the work being done to help filmmakers, and especially we cinematographers, bring their creative vision to the big screen with the best possible image quality, protecting their vision throughout production, even into the growing critical topic of digital migration and preservation, a really relevant and increasingly urgent issue for us now. Through the Council's 2 reports titled The Digital Dilemma. They're both available to be downloaded online, and he can probably tell you more about that. If you don't know the Digital Dilemma reports, it's tough reading, it'll scare your socks off, but it's really important. I hope you enjoy these sessions, ask lots of questions, and share your thoughts. I wish I could stay. Unfortunately, I have a whole bunch of meetings I have to go to at the Wilshire main offices, but I really appreciate the opportunity just to say hello to you and wish you the very best. So right now I'd like Andy to come back and introduce the first session. Thank you.
All right, thank you, John, for those inspiring words. And I'm going to bring back the slides here because, technology sometimes has a mind of its own. There we go. So John said a couple things. I know I said I wouldn't be up here very long, but John said something about conversation here. So I do want to encourage you all to think about what you want to ask or discuss with the presenters that are up today. This is a conversation. It's not, even though it's a little dark in here because we want the slides to look good, it's not nap time. So please be engaged. And actually, speaking of the lights, is that Richard back there or Rose? Lauren, hi Lauren. Can you bring up the house lights a little bit? Because I just want to do a quick audience poll here. This is the attendee participation part of the program. So how many of you, is this your first visit to the Pickford Center as part of the Cinematography Summit or any other event? Okay, so we have a lot of return visitors. All right, so that means we're going to cover a little bit of background in some of these presentations to catch you up for those of you who have heard about some of this. So we're going to talk about ACES and, again, following up on John's comments about doing things for cinematographers, for the craftspeople. That is one of the things that ACES is all about. So just, again, a quick poll. How many of you have heard of ACES? All right, almost everybody, maybe everybody. How many of you have used ACES on a project? Okay, that's pretty good. How many of you think ACES is really complicated? All right, so that's fine. You know, no bashful. No, there's no reason to be bashful here. You're all amongst friends. So this group that's going to come up now is going to completely demystify everything about ACES for you and hopefully inspire you to demand ACES on your next project. And with that, I'd like to hand over the podium to Annie Chang, Vice President of Creative Technologies for Universal Pictures and the ACES Project Chair. Annie, you're welcome.
Hello, everyone. Hi, I'm Annie, and yes, I am the project chair for ACES as well. And today, for this session, we're going to be covering just a few things. It's great to see so many people have heard of ACES, so that's good, and hopefully we can convince you that it's a good thing. So we're going to give you just a very quick background on ACES. We didn't want to go too far into the weeds of it, so if you do have questions afterwards, please feel free to grab any of us down here, because we're happy to talk to you this morning about more about ACES and go into more detail. I will also be giving you some updates on what has been going on with ACES. And then also the fun part of my session, which I'm really looking forward to, is a panel discussion on the real-world usage of ACES with Jeff Boyle and Andrew Shulkind. So that should be the fun part. So just bear with me for these first 5 minutes here, or first 10 minutes here, as we actually go through the other parts. So I'll give you some background right now. So first off, what is ACES, I should say. So this is sort of our normal speak here. But ACES is a free, open, device-independent color management and image interchange system that enables creation of digital masters suitable for long-term archiving. Okay, so what does that actually mean? Well, first off, we figured it's easier to explain maybe what ACES is not. So it is not a software application that you download and then just run. It is not considered a workflow, although you will hear me sometimes mistakenly saying that. It is a framework, actually, for creation of your content. And ACES is not a look. That's actually very important, and we can talk more a little bit about that during the panel discussion. But what ACES is that it is a full set of data, metadata, and file format specifications for digital production. So basically, ACES does provide all these components to bring your camera files into the ACES space, work within ACES to get the color and the looks that you actually want, and then output to different display devices so that you can optimize for the different display technologies out there, whether it be a projector or a regular 709 display or an HDR display. So the idea is that you have these standardized components that help you create the look that you want to get without any secret sauce, proprietary type of stuff. It is implemented in cameras and carts, color correction systems, and VFX software. It is, as I mentioned, standardized by the SMPTE, and it will be soon by the ISO organization. And basically, it's the basis for clear color communication everywhere. So when you want to interchange your looks and what you're trying to do, your creative intent with your color, or even if it's black and white, that works too. That is what we use ACES as the language to basically communicate all of that information. For cinematographers specifically, there are some benefits for ACES, and I just want to cover them just for your benefit. The key with ACES is that it does force questions to be asked at critical points in the pipeline. So these kind of questions are really about the color and how you're going to reproduce it on the different displays. So the idea here is those type of questions are: what type of looks are you using? What type of lookup tables or LUTs are you actually planning to use? Who's making the LUTs? Are they actually usable for all these different display devices, from high dynamic range all the way through down to your standard dynamic range? So these questions are actually really important, and a lot of times we sort of just forget to ask them ahead of time, and this is sort of the thing that ACES helps provide. It does maintain the maximum image fidelity, so we do actually have all the bits of information from your camera all the way through the process, which is really great, so that you can maintain the highest fidelity of your camera files through the entire process chain. We do like to say that it does reduce the pre-grade time, because this allows you to then have more time for your creativity, of course. And because of the ability of the output transforms that I was mentioning that allows you to optimize for those different display devices, we can enable high dynamic range and wide color gamut without committing to a specific secret sauce proprietary type of technology. It also provides a future-proof archive that's for the digital source master, which is important, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the update section. So if you want to find out more about ACES, you can go to acescentral.com. This is the best place to sign up, and this is where you can find out more information about ACES. If you have any questions, there's a lot of experts on there that are happy to help you, and then you can also see what we've been doing there for the latest news. That is acescentral.com. It is free, so feel free to just sign up. I see people taking pictures. That's fine. Take away there. But yes, just go to acescentral.com. If you sign up there, you can see all the great discussions that are going on over there. All right, so that's the ACES background. It was very, very fast, I know, and short. But like I said, we actually have several experts here that are happy to talk to you. I'll be here too as well, so feel free to just come grab me and just ask away your questions. And we do have time at the end of the session for more questions as well. So now let me give you some updates about what's been going on with ACES. So what we're going to cover are some of the output transforms that are coming out in mid-June. Just talk a little bit about this effort we have called ACES Next and our new leadership here. We'll talk about the delivery and archive standards that have just been published by SMPTE for the Digital Source Master, and then just two quick updates on something called the ACES Primer and the update on some of our new ACES product partners that have just signed on with us. All right, so just a quick update. So ACES 1.0 was released in 2015, and it gave us a great framework to basically start using. But then at the time, before we actually released that, there actually were no commercially available HDR or high dynamic range displays at the time. So during that time, we did release this HDR starter pack that contained some transforms that we thought were usable by the industry, but there weren't any, for example, any digital cinema HDR output transforms because there was no projector at that point. Over the last few years, we've been working through with ACES 1.0, and we discovered that there were some holes, some missing transforms, basically, to use for the different display devices. We are going to be releasing some new HDR output transforms that will work with both HDR projectors out there and the HDR displays. This was all based upon a lot of work that was done with several productions that were using different HDR from theatrical to the home side. And those will be released this month. And they're going through beta testing right now. So if any of you are interested in getting your hands on these transforms, if you have a show and you actually need to put it out for say a 4,000 nit Dolby Pulsar or a 1,000 nit HDR10 type of thing. I don't know if some of you may have heard those terms before. We do have those transforms available. Also, we found a few gaps with the standard dynamic range output transforms, using to give more capability for some more display white points. So those also will be released as well with the HDR transforms. So that's the output for ASUS 1.0. So the 1.0 was basically the first initial output of ASUS, and we're going to say once we have these output transforms out there in the world that ASUS 1.0 will now be complete. So that means we're actually moving on to the new world of ASUS called ASUS Next. These are the leaders. That there's me in the middle, but we also have Joachim Zell. He goes by Jay-Z. He'll be presenting in just a little bit. He's one of my vice chairs, and then also a guy named Rod Bogart, formerly of HBO and Pixar. He's also one of my vice chairs as well. So we're the new ASUS leadership. And we're basically here to enhance and extend ASUS 1.0 because what we want to do is make it easier for people to use and provide all the functionality that a lot of people want and desire, and basically also make some improvements upon what we had seen with ASUS 1.0 just in order to drive wider adoption. So what we ended up doing is we've been spending this time doing a listening tour over the last year, listening to different groups that have used ASUS 1.0 to try and get some feedback. What did you like? What did you not like? We are starting to wind down that tour, and so for those of you who have used ASUS, Jay-Z and I would be really happy to hear any of your feedback, both good and bad, with the process, because we're going to collate this information and create a list of all the items that we feel should actually be improved upon, and then we're going to post that list to ASUS Central. So that's another reason for you to sign on to ASUSCentral.com. But we'll put the findings, and then what we're going to do is we're actually going to start doing an open source-like development for ASUS Next. So in the past, ASUS had been very much a closed system. The Academy took care of a lot of the work, which in some parts were great because then many of us didn't have to worry about it. But then we decided for ASUS Next, it made a lot more sense if we could have a more open source-like environment so that everyone in the community could basically help and create some solutions and work on the development, do a lot of testing and that sort of thing. So we're working on transitioning the ASUS work from a closed system to an open system. So that's what's going on for ASUS Next. So then John Bailey had mentioned the digital dilemma. This is a copy of one of the versions that were out there. Basically, the digital dilemma was published 10 years ago, and in it, it basically stated the fact that there was an issue that needed to be addressed. Here, I'll just read this. The development of requirements and specifications for digital file formats that support long-term digital preservation, and basically a need for delivering an archive solution with the emphasis on the definition of the digital source master. So the digital source master, or DSM, is what we consider is the archive of archive. Right? It's the crown jewel that has the color intent that was created during the time it was made, and we want to preserve that for future generations, but we also want it to have the highest dynamic range possible. So no limiting viewing transforms, for example, that are just limiting the dynamic range to the technology of displays today. So I am happy to say that we do now have a solution for this digital source master. It is called, it's a lovely, just rolls off the tongue, the SMPTE ST 2067-50, also known as the ASUS IMF application number 5. So you can just call it application 5 or ASUS IMF, something like that. But it has just been published recently from the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers. And it basically defines the digital equivalent of finished film negative for the archive. So this includes both picture, sound, it includes subtitling, it could actually include different versioning. So it's for those of you that are not familiar with IMF, that stands for the Interoperable Master Format. I actually had the pleasure of chairing that group actually at SMPTE originally. And what that is it's a file format that gives you some flexibility on the versioning and how you archive things. So it's a great format, and now we've combined ACES and IMF together. But the hard part now is the implementation, and that means they have to test some tools as we roll this out. So what that means is that we actually have to test this footage with something, test its format. So we have this project called The Troop at the Academy. It's a redo, and it's a great little piece of content that was basically about the King's Troop, Royal Horse Artillery. But it's being remastered, and it's in progress right now, and it's being used as a case study for the Academy, and they're remastering it to 4K, UHD, and HDR. So the idea was, why don't we use this content to test the archive process and the file format for SMPTE? So that is the plan. And then from this, we could actually create best practices for the digital source master archive. So that's sort of the plan. And the idea is, assuming you can recover your bits in 50 years or 100 years, you will know what the picture should look like, because the actual file format, the ACES IMF, is a standard, and you know it's documented, and you'll be able to recover those bits there. So the last thing to cover here is just some quick updates. We have the ACES primer, which has been kind of been a long process in doing, but it's a great document to explain how ACES is actually used, and to give you, for anyone that's not technical, a good basis on what ACES is. So that is actually going to be released this month and posted on acescentral.com. And then also just a quick note, the companies highlighted there in the gold on the product partner side there. Those are the latest product partners that have just joined the ACES logo program. So we're really happy to have them. But yeah, so that's basically the updates that we have. So if I could ask my two panelists to come on up here into the front here, we can actually start our little panel about the real world usage of ACES. Thank you.
What time does the other person get here?
Yeah, that's the ghost DP. Yeah. They've got a lot to say, actually. So, all right, everyone. So I am pleased to announce that I have Jeff Boyle joining me, as well as Andrew Shulkin there. And we're going to talk a little bit about ACES, and in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and just put just a slide in the background here. This gives you sort of an idea of what a traditional on-set workflow looks like, using just any old camera proprietary system, and then versus on the bottom there the ACES system there, and it looks like ACES may be a little bit more complex, but it actually isn't. It actually is just making things more normalized on the input, so you can use any camera and then just use the ACES process throughout. Anyway, so I know. So we know that obviously ACES. I'm sure you guys have all heard. A lot of Hollywood big blockbusters have used ACES, but I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with the fact that ACES obviously can be used on low-budget productions and also on pretty much any type of content. And so thought maybe you guys could maybe talk a little bit about your experiences. Why don't we start with you, Jeff?
I wanted to work with ACES on very low-budget films, and the reason I was interested in ACES is that I realized in 2005, when I found myself screaming at a DIT, "They're my pictures." I think I mentioned something about sex and travel as well. It dawned on me that I had no control anymore. That when I started, I had printer lights. I knew that if we went to 25 across, or the lab base reference, whatever it was, that what I shot was what we would see, good or bad. And if I'd done something wrong and it was printed at base lights, then we'd see that I'd done something wrong. But that's cool. We knew where we were. When we went to telecine and scanning, we could line the scanner up to telecine alignment film. If there was any query, you'd say, line it up to TAF, put my stuff on, does it look good or bad? Again, there's a standard reference. And there I found myself in 2005 in a totally digital world, not knowing what the hell was happening. and what was right and what was wrong. And as I did in a presentation last November in Amsterdam, you've got a standard lookup table for the Alexa. What's your problem? Well, I showed 12 of them last November from 12 different post houses. They're all standard lookup tables, and they're all different. There is no standard. So I wanted a standard. And it's the reason I got into ACES in the first place. I realized that if you had a world where you had a standard input transform, standard output transform, it doesn't matter. None of that matters. What matters is there is a standard, an independent standard. But the only way I could see to implement it meant having a DIT on set or using a Canon with a proxy output and a bloody expensive monitor. It's not going to happen in the real world. And yeah, you can do it with a DIT, but I'm getting into very low budget stuff because I'm having a great time. I did have a clip to show you, but we decided that perhaps chainsaws, axes, was perhaps not appropriate for here. But it was an ACES workflow, the entire thing.
Could you name the title?
Oh, Attack of the Adult Babies.
Look that up. You should see the trailer. It does. The color is amazing on it. The blood looks really red. But yes.
The thing is, that was a standard approach I'll describe how I got there now. So I was beta testing Prelight for Filmlight, and I noticed that it said on one of the options, output with input transform and output transform. And I went, hang on a minute. You mean I can output a LUT, including the whole ACES process? No, it can't be. Can we have a slide? So I took a slide. This is, we'll just go on to it. Yeah. So this came from some camera tests I did with the ACS in Australia. I have them from all the cameras. This was just taken because it's a good image to work with. And so we got the original. Then I put the essential Prelight no processing, added the IDT and ODT to it, which is that, then color corrected it. And then tried looking at putting out the LUT that combined all of that and the LUT without it into ACES. These are just showing, this is into Lattice, trying it in different software to see what happened. And the answer was I could actually produce a lookup table that simulated the whole process. And all I had to do was take the log out the camera and a standard 709 monitor, and I could see and then put it into an ACES post process with just the IDT and the ODT set as standard. Hang on a minute, a standard? An electronic 25 across? This was, blew me away. And I tested and tested, and it worked. So I then generated, at a workshop we did in Amsterdam with the NSC, output tables for a lot of cameras. And we've basically done them for every camera and every combination you can get. They're downloadable. You can simulate the workflow. All you have to do is load the LUT either into a LUT box on set, or in fact, you can load them into most cameras. And you just have the output going out to your standard 709 monitor, and from then on, you are in ACES space. Whatever you see on the floor is what you will see in post if you add the IDT and the ODT for that specific camera and monitor you're working to. Simple. We have a standard. We have a reference. It's usable on zero budget shoots. So the next stage is I'm asked to shoot Attack of the Adult Babies. That came about because the director and I were meant to be doing another movie, a serious budget one that fell apart at the last minute. We both blocked out 3 months. What are we going to do? Dom turns to me, well, I've got this idea for something called Attack of the Adult Babies. How could I say no? Just the name of it. So we work out how to do it. And on that, I generated a lookup table at the very beginning that combined the look of the film, which was a kind of amber, contrasty look, and the IDT, ODT of ACES. And we shot with that on all the monitors. And we did that in a simple way. We loaded it into a bolt, and everything was transmitted via the bolt. So everyone saw the pictures through the LUT and through the ACES process. The rushes were made on the basic LUT alone in Resolve. IDT and ODT is standard for the camera. The final post was done in, God, I can't remember what it's called now. It's the Quantel Rio. Again in ACES, again using the LUT on its own and just the IDT and ODT. It looked the same the whole way through the process. I've got control again. And that really excited me. Now, I've made a variation of this where there is no LUT at all in it. It's just the look of the whole process. There's also a version with a 0.85 contrast because I found the basic IDT ODT look a little contrasty for me. But then I always used to shoot on low contrast stocks, and I would get the contrast in the shot by kicking the bollocks out of it with light. If I want it contrasty, I'll light it contrasty. If I want it warm, I'll put an 81 EF on the camera. If I want the foreground blue and the background orange, then I'll light it that way. And if it just goes through with no DIT, no grader, no on-set colorist, just put it in your dailies with the IDT and ODT on it, don't touch it, and it's fine. And it takes me back in a way to when I was shooting commercials where we would shoot the Kodak plus grayscale, which just was black, white, and gray, and gave you voltages on it. And we shot it, and there was a note on the bottom saying, line up to this and take your hands off. And then we flipped the card over, and on the back of it said, remember, we know where your children live. And I wanted to get back to that. And that's effectively, by doing what I've done in these tests, is what I've done. And you can download them all and have a play. That's it, really.
Thank you.
And now it gets complicated.
Andrew, how about your experience?
So I started, trying to remember how I came into ACE originally. I think it was through my colorist. I love being in a room like this where we can talk really specifically about cinematography-focused topics because I think ACES has advantages to cinematographers, it has advantages to visual effects supervisors, it has advantages to colorists, there's advantages to post supervisors. It's different things to different people. I think that's some of the reasons why it's complicated, because a lot of times we hear something that might not be so pivotal to what we're doing in terms of how it's going to mate. It's our job overall to understand what's happening and keep it in the right kind of color family. But as the visual effects supervisor is going to take this linear file, I just need it to come back in the same color space that it went to him in. And how he deals with it is kind of his responsibility. So I do a lot of commercials and movies, and on the commercial side, it's usually visual effects heavy. And I come from a background in color and preview system and all that. So it was color something that I've always been really connected to. The most recent example that I've had, and maybe you can put that slide up, is just an example of a movie that we shot that was super dark. And it was a great example of how in our kind of digital age, we have a ton of different cameras that we capture on and a ton of different displays that we display on. And to Jeff's point, there was a time when we shot on film and we processed it, and then we projected it on film, and there were these constants. And yeah, maybe the projector bulb was dim, and that was kind of the only variable. And the bath was variable, and we could kind of tweak that to match it. Now that we have so many different things on the input side, so many things on the output side, we have to find a way of mapping them. And ACES has really solved that problem. I don't get paid to be here. Maybe you're getting paid to be here. I'm just a guy who's used it and has seen that it's really obvious. And like when I go to a great restaurant, I just want to refer it to everybody that I know. So what I found is, in a circumstance like this, where with the movies that you see on the screen, we have a super dark environment, and in this case, we shot Canon and Alexa in red, and we wanted to have as broad a range as possible. I knew that I wanted to use the sensitive end of the sensor. I knew that, with these cameras now, we can shoot at 3200 ISO and T1 lenses and shoot with the tiniest amount of light that we can create nuance and detail. And not because we didn't have money to do it. They were both sizable movies. We had balloons and cranes and the whole thing, but to be able to kind of use the nuance of that shadow zone. That was the goal on this stuff. So when doing that, obviously we weren't just using the toe end of the curve. We don't wanted to shoot with the bottom 2 or 3 stops. We shot an expanded range. But if you're shooting that expanded range on set, you're looking at a super lifted image, which isn't obviously what you want. So that was where ACES came in a really natural way on the last couple of movies. So it was about having a transform that we saw on the day, and then as it gets through the whole pipeline and we get into our final color, we're looking at a grade that crushes everything back down. It was something that we saw on the day when we shot 3 or 4 months earlier. In a movie we did called The Ritual that was really visual effects heavy, there was a creature, and the creature went off to one post house that was in, it was maybe in Denmark. And most of the post work happened in the UK. We colored in the UK, we shot in Romania. And so, you know, this is like in our global world, we're always kind of shooting and posting in different cities. And so we need a protocol to be able to communicate. And the amazing thing about ACES, and the reason why I keep coming back to it in different ways as it grows, is because it just gives you the biggest bucket possible. And one image that I think we don't have is showing color space and showing that there's Rec 709 and 2020 and all these different color spaces, both on the imaging side and even on the display side, sRGB and all the kind of displays that all of our stuff ends up getting displayed on. And ACES is a huge triangle. It's just the biggest bucket possible. So nothing bigger is out there. This is everything you want is inside that triangle. And that's kind of the easiest sell for ACES. So that's why when you're shooting a bright movie, a dark movie, something that you want to communicate that's going to end up on a screen. These last 2 movies are now on Netflix. Obviously watching, you know, a super dark movie, I picked some of the darkest images here just so that you could see that even in a screen where there's light falling on the screen, or maybe I'm on my iPad on an airplane, you know, you still need to know some minimum amount of shadow detail. There's a creature that at some points we're trying to hide, so you don't want to see that, you know, rigging. And we also had a bunch of visual effects. So we have markers and tracking points and stuff that all have to be keyable or all have to be identifiable. So ACES was sort of a natural choice, no matter how you look at it.
Thanks. So you brought this up a little bit, so I just wanted to explore it a bit. And Andy had actually asked this question earlier about ACES being complicated. I mean, I think we've heard that, and we see some folks that actually think that's the case. Do you maybe have some feedback or some advice for the folks from a complication standpoint?
It's as complicated as you want it to be. However, I would say there are people with vested interests who will try and make it more complicated, because the post houses who sell you their magic sauces and their special recipes have a vested interest in you not using ACES. Because using ACES, it's very easy to produce multiple outputs, and they can't charge as much.
That's right. I think the biggest hang-up is people being confused about what it is. And I think that's because it's so versatile, because it's so many things. Here's the way that I use ACES. I say to my DAT, who usually is someone who's really just managing assets, I'll say, let's use ACES on this. We have a conversation with a post producer and the colorist, who I try to kind of get on board as early as possible. I say, let's use ACES. And the only time ACES ever comes up again is when I'm in Final Color and saying, is ACES clicked on? We look at, this is the ACES, right? That's the only engagement I actually have to have with ACES. It requires the DIT to understand that he has to select ACES based on the IDT, based on the camera that we're using, and that everyone along the way is selecting the ODT. But here's an example of where ACES would have helped but didn't. In one of these movies, we had that conversation, let's do ACES. And Shed was on board, and everyone was on board. It was kind of the best case scenario. The cameras were all compliant, which all cameras are now, so that was pretty good. But the issue was that we had an editor with us on set. We were in Romania, up a mountain, hours outside of Bucharest. So it was not like a perfect scenario where we're on a studio and everyone has house power. So we're having to run, we basically set some rough looks. I said to the colorist, give me a night look, and we kind of went back and forth until we liked it, but give me a night exterior look with fire, a night interior look, a day interior look, it was sort of like some roughs, and I gave some profiles on not too much contrast, a lot of contrast, not too much saturation. I don't want anything clipping, but I want to see that good shadow detail. So I went in with like 6 of these different LUTs, and that stuff was applied. But because we had the editor with us, the dailies that were made, we were archiving footage that was going back to London to be archived, and that was going to be colored as they were starting on that process. But the editor was getting dailies that were not colored. He just created it. They created an additional step where the log C stuff was exported as just something that he could work with as a temp. And that was uncolored throughout the whole process. So then even though visual effects is working in ACES, colorist is working in ACES, we come into Final Color with ACES, the director had only seen the temp look because that was something the editor kind of slapped a 709 look on. And he's looking at it as we're in Final Color. I said, well, let's bring this up. And he said, oh my God, there's so much range here. I was like, right. I mean, you've been looking at something that didn't have what we shot. That was just sort of a random thing. And somehow the edit, everything the editor was working with was left out of the process. And it was just sort of a communication thing. And I think that what part of the great thing about having these conversations is that the cinematographers, we can say, this is something we want to do. And to the colorists, you can say, this is something we want to do. And because we're sort of stewards of the image, that becomes more important. I just wanted to tie into something that John said a minute ago, Bailey said, that I think that as we're going into this kind of future place where we have even more displays and that we don't have, it's not just a screen or a monitor or Sony that we can call up or Panasonic that we have a relationship with, but it's, all kinds of the different displays that come out of China and come out of, all over the place around the world where my, phone is not the same from my iPhone to somebody else's iPhone. I think there just isn't the same kind of tolerance. This kind of a process becomes even more important. It becomes even more important, and I think our job becomes that much more important to steward the overall idea of where this thing is going, whether it appears on a screen or it appears on a tablet or, wherever it appears.
And a really important thing there is on a very low budget movie like Attack of the Adult Babies, which is never going to go out into the cinema. It's purely for... Yeah, right. The one before that went out on Netflix with the same director, but Adult Babies is not going on Netflix. It's out on Blu-ray and DVD, and that's what it was graded for. And then you get a message saying, oh, by the way, Jeff, we're having the premiere at Fright Fest in London. You think, great. It's going to be on the IMAX screen in the Empire. We've kept it in 4K the whole way through, which you can afford to do on low-budget stuff, which is a different conversation, but quite interesting. And the directors and the producers turn around to you and say, no, Jeff, you cannot have another grade for that screen. There is just no way on earth. I thought, yeah, but can we just re-render it with a different ODT? And they'll go, what? I go, can I talk to the post house? Talk to the post house and run me another one, please. And they re-rendered it. It cost nothing. We didn't regrade it. Was it the best it could be on the IMAX screen? Probably not. Was it staggeringly better than it would have been with the 709 going up there? Yeah. So, that's a great example of aces on a very low budget shoot.
That's great.
One other quick comment to, I think, your original question about pain points or where people, I'm just looking at this image here. I don't know if you can see it on this, but you can here. There's fringing where the guy's hands are in front of that light bulb. And it was something we dealt with throughout the course of this movie and the way that we shot. That shot was on Canon C700, and it was something that we dealt with in color. And what is this? And why are we seeing that? What's that chromatic aberration from? And so do we go in and we pick the magenta? How do we kind of deal with this? And what we found was that we could solve it with the debayer. And I think that where the visual effects companies, where post houses really have their secrets, Aces is not the secret sauce. It was never the secret sauce. You still have the colorist. We're just roughing it in so that we can start with a baseline. Yeah. But the debayer, I think, is a secret sauce that no one talks about because that can be something specific to everyone.
And the colorists that I work with, all love the fact that they've got a lot of their work already done. The work that they have to do to get it into a workable area has been done for them. Their job is now just to do the creative stuff.
That's really vital. I wish I had said that. That was really good. Only because what Aces allows you to do is it allows you to start working with nuance. And I also, in another thing we can talk about later, as get involved with Facebook and Google and these kind of other ways where I think already work is sort of going to shit. But I think that to be able to stay on a high level and be able to just come in to then spend the 2 hours, 2 weeks, however long you have in that final grade on nuance is what we're here for. Like that's why the Academy exists, I think.
And it was interesting talking to both of you because I feel like you have a range of experience with ACES. And I mean, Jeff, you're very, you get really down into the weeds and you're making all these LUTs and everything. But then Andrew, you were mentioning like, hey, you just want to know that, you just know some basic things about it and you don't get down into the weeds about it. So I thought it was actually very interesting about the way you guys approach ACES. And the fact that you don't have to know, you don't have to be a color scientist or be an Alex Forsyth to basically be able to do all this.
And that's why I put all those LUTs up there, so that any DP could just grab that LUT, stick it in their system, and be working in ACES without thinking about it.
Thank you for doing that. All right, so Andrew, you had brought up a little bit about the future with Facebook and that sort of thing, and maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the future-facing things that you've been doing, and that maybe it's a place where ACES may be able to help or maybe not. But I mean, I think there's some interesting stuff that you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting space. I think it's sort of an extension of having a ton of different input devices and a ton of different output devices, and you take that to the nth degree, and now you're shooting on a ton of cameras at one time. Whether it's shooting spherically or volumetrically, we're shooting for different layers of interactivity with Google and Facebook and Samsung, and so this is a camera that we built. Go back to that one. There was this camera that we built, 18 cameras, and it was recording to codecs onboard S recorders, so it was recording raw. It's basically we were doing this Nike job, and we needed to shoot a 360 plate, and everyone was using GoPros, and obviously that wasn't going to fly for what we needed to do. We needed dynamic range, so I sort of assembled a bunch of parts together like this, and we made it into a product, and then put it on a rover, and it moved it in different ways. But the picture on the right goes to kind of show so there's 18 different images here, and they were 2K, and it was recording raw. And so what do you do with all that footage, especially in a spherical thing? This is from 3 years ago, but at this time, and anytime you're shooting spherically, which isn't, it has its own challenges, a lot of the cameras that are out there have very limited dynamic range. But when you have a camera like this, or when we shoot, sometimes we shoot with red nodally, or sometimes we shoot red on a motion control arm that we can kind of move around and shoot nodally. The key is always dynamic range, because you have the sun and you have a dark shadow. And as we kind of move into these more interactive environments, there's always these extremes. And so I think, again, that's where ACES comes into play, because whether you're displaying on a phone or a screen or an immersive, like a cinema, there's this, I don't know if you guys have heard of it, there's this arena that we've been working on in Las Vegas. There's going to be another one in London, which is 170,000 times the size of a regular screen. So we're getting into kind of different layers of imaging, but we need to keep the same delicate nuance and the same kind of stewardship over the image that we've always had on whatever we're shooting on. On the next one, the next slide is light field. It's the same concept. We have a ton of different imagers, and how we light field is kind of a whole other thing. We're still a couple years away from this really being a true product, but this is where you're able to kind of see. With ray tracing, you can see the glancing angle of light in a dynamic way. And so lighting and being able to maintain a look and the range is getting more important, not less important, as we go to these kind of digital formats. What's the last one that I have? Volumetric, the same concept. A ton of cameras capturing in interesting ways. We've been doing this with a couple different manufacturers. And in this case, to drift from ACES for a second, the important thing in all these places, and the reason why I get involved, is because I think they're all really corruptible technologies where we start to lose our grasp on what the art form is. In this case, this is an outside-in. Spherical is cameras shooting out, volumetric is outside-in, but it basically creates a 3D asset. And what's interesting about this space is that because all the cameras, when you have 106 cameras, you're not going to have 106 reds, not yet at least. So we're using these small. I'm sort of coming into an existing industry, and they've always been using these kind of small machine vision cameras. And we're deriving an image computationally, and so there isn't a camera that's covering every single pixel. So, and some of that is being interpolated. So you have to set a protocol for what that interpolation looks like, what sharpness looks like, what color looks like. And because there's such limited dynamic range, we're trying to color and light in a way that feels faithful and feels like if we're in this room that there's a bright front light and there's very little light coming from behind. But if you don't have that much range, you still have to kind of light it globally, which means that now we're pushing lighting down the end, because now we're capturing the CG asset. So now not only are we pushing color, after the digital kind of revolution happened, we pushed color down the line, and we pushed even latitude down the line, and we're shooting 8K or larger, we've pushed framing down the line. I find a lot of times, even in traditional stuff, we'll kind of, we'll crop in on that, or we'll reframe, or we'll zoom on that. Now we're actually pushing lighting down the line. So I think all these kind of future technologies, there's one more, I think it's replay, which is something we're doing in the sports arena, where we have a bunch of cameras that allow a kind of, it's a more limited version of the last image, where you have just a ring instead of a whole dome. But basically, you're mapping a space to be seen from different angles. And in all these cases, I think it just reiterates the point and the need for being able to have some control over the image.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that insight into the future of some interesting content creation. All right, so I think one of the takeaways I think that we had talked a little bit about the control. You mentioned it, Jeff. I think in what you were saying earlier about the control over your workflow, because I mean, obviously, this whole future world, it's a little nutty. But let's bring it back to the stuff that we actually know, and then maybe just talk a little bit about the control that you feel like you do have with your digital workflows. I think that was an interesting conversation we had had.
Well, one thing I wanted to say about that is that I think the interesting thing, speaking about control, is that I think in a typical environment, I'm thinking about this product, I'm thinking about what ACES is and what the purpose of it is, and what an organization that created it, and what the value is of having people like us talk about it. And the reality is, I think Jeff and I are both subversive people. Maybe Jeff is more subversive than I am. But like, we're the least likely people to stand up here and talk about a product. But I think that speaks to what the product is and how disruptive and important it is.
Absolutely. I mean, the one aspect of it is the whole thing of taking back control of someone. I keep going on and on about this, having been horrified, having done movies. Most expensive one I did was 50 million, but of being locked out of the grade. And so I have to find some way of imposing my image, my pictures. Ego? Yeah, damn right. I need to lock that in somehow. And by previewing with ACES on set, I know that look will stay through the grade, through the edit, and once you've got the director and producer locked into a look in the grade, in the edit, they'll take it into the grade with them. They won't fight you. And for me, that's really important.
Yeah, I think the idea of not being there is really important. Whether it's on a movie, I do a lot of commercials, and I've used ACES on a bunch of commercials when whenever possible, we're always using ACES, and I'm rarely in the grade. Not even because I'm not there or it's in another country. Sometimes that's true, but in general, it's like a place for everyone to sit back and kind of hang out. The agency gets to come to LA for a couple of days and hang out at Company 3, and it's one of these things where it's a cultural thing, and so I think that being able to at least have a reference point. I think that the other thing is that what ACES is great about is setting a baseline. So if you have a new colorist, or if you have someone that's in another country that you're not able to communicate with, it's a way of being able to kind of set a bar.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Great. Can we turn on the house lights? Because we can open it up for questions now. And we have some folks running around with some microphones. So if you have any questions for our wonderful panel up here.
I'm just going to repeat, it's 25 across.
It sounds fantastic, but how do you convince a whole production to actually go with it? And this is where I've come in. They go, there are all these houses, visual effects houses that we're going to put it out to. They're all going to have different setups, which is like scares shit out of you. And we're going to have to ask them all to do ACES, and it's too hard. And we don't really have that much post set up anyway. We're going to do it in the back room. And
It's really, really, really easy. You tell the producer it's going to save him money.
Exactly.
That's all you need to do. And they will make the post houses who, for God's sake, if they can't click on color management, ACES, CCT, then they shouldn't be doing the bloody job in the first place.
And actually, if you don't mind me just jumping in, so I used to work for Marvel Studios, and so those shows are very well known for having at least 12 to 20 VFX houses. Marvel uses the ACES process exclusively, and actually the VFX houses, I think it's you're going to start seeing it start turning over, where VFX houses are the ones that actually do love ACES because they know what they're getting. They understand the file format. They already work in a linear space, which is what ACES, the big file is. And also the color management, being able to get the looks that you folks put on set, onto the in a standardized fashion onto those ACES files really helps the viewing platform for the VFX houses. So that is just one thing. I mean, I think you're going to start seeing it that it becomes a thing for VFX houses actually, because it is a much more standardized format, or it is a standardized format, that they can actually utilize. Sorry, Andrew.
I was just going to say, I would have, what I do on every job now is have a kind of private conversation with the visual effects supervisor, a private conversation with the post producer, and a private conversation with the line producer, and say, hey, look, I think it's worth looking at this thing, ACES. It's going to save you money, and it doesn't cost anything up front, and you're already doing it, because each of them is going to have a vested interest and be kind of, be paranoid or ambivalent or not want to take that leap, but each of them has a vested interest in doing it, because the visual effects supervisor is going to get better assets. They're going to already be in a linear space. The the color house is going to be able to jump in and spend less time, and maybe they're still going to charge as if you weren't using ACES. That's between them and the production. But at the end of the day, I think by having those kind of individual conversations, you can get there, because at the end of the day, it serves us. It serves us to make sure that image stays there, and it serves all of them too. But when you have these big collective conversations, a lot of people start to get skittish.
This is Rolf Coulant from Germany. I have a question, might be a little bit beyond ACES, but very important for us. Does the Academy have any access to manufacturers to better up the deburring process? Because it gives the conditions to work with ACES, and we have a lot of questions to the manufacturers, because we know that there are a lot of possibilities to change this deburring process in certain way, but manufacturers are afraid to open these possibilities. So is there any connection to better up this process?
Maybe I can take that. Actually, the next panel will just touch a little bit on this, I think, and I think you should also talk to Jay-Z, who's doing the next presentation. But the discussion there is really looking at the camera transforms, and also it's more the next session that's coming up is about the exposure index, but it does have a bearing on the debearing. That was kind of strange how I said that.
And I agree with you totally. It's a huge, huge area we should be looking at.
But we are working with all the major manufacturers on the actual process of bringing them in and looking at the fringing issue and that sort of thing as well. So I'm glad you brought that up. But yes, the answer is yes.
Hi, Serge Desrosiers from Canada. I did a couple of feature films with ACES, but only in the post-production process. And I'm just being curious as how do we get the lookup tables all the way on set that we can see all the images and clarify? Is it the regular work? Like I do the lookup tables, put them in the camera and stuff like that. Is it the same regular way with ACES? Never done it?
Yeah, I mean, if you want your lookup tables, then there are a number of ways of doing it. The simplest is create your lookup tables in Prelight, because Prelight gives you an option to output including the whole lot, and you're done. That's it, that's simple. The complicated way is to use something like Lattice, where you take your lookup table and you combine it with the CTL files that are doable, just more complicated. You need to get someone to do it for you, basically. But if you're doing it in Prelight, piece of piss.
I just want to throw one last thing about that. When you mentioned just using it in post, I think that's another thing to talk about, the versatility. Ideally, you're using ACES throughout the whole process from start to finish, but you don't have to. You can actually start in ACES, and then if for some reason the post house wants to do something different, at least you're already in ACES, and you know, and okay, this is what we had. Okay, now we can turn it off and do something else. Or the flip side in your example of where it wasn't done in ACES to begin with, but now for versioning, creating new deliverables, and for preservation and archiving, you can click in at the end.
But I noticed that there is something with the colorists that I think there's a lobbying to be done by your part, because young production houses, like they said, yes, totally, we love ACES. And other older production houses kind of really, they don't really want to go into that process. And I had to really push them and cancel like 2 days of color timing to go back to whatever I wanted to do. But sometimes it's a hard way.
Yes, thank you. So unfortunately we're out of time, but we're all going to be here, so we're happy to answer questions outside of the session. Andy, I think we're going to flip this back to Andy Maltz.
If you think about this in terms of ACES is replacing the standards we lost when we moved away from film. Right? When we had film, you didn't think about how to make the negative. Kodak, Fujifilm, Agfa, they had that down. And there were standards, even de facto standards around that. You didn't think about what ingredients had to, and what was the recipe for the soup at the labs. Right? Deluxe, Technicolor, Photochem, Metrocolor, if you go way back when. They handled that for you. You got to focus on getting good pictures. All right. So we're in this transition now, hopefully closer to the end of the transition than the beginning of the transition, to put in a standardized digital motion picture imaging infrastructure that is the digital version of what we had with film. And then once that's all done, you can just go back to getting beautiful images into the camera, onto the discs, up on the screen, and we need your help to get there.